Hello, my name is Henry Thrun, and this week's Torah portion is Miketz, or at the end. We had our presidential election a couple months ago. Several years ago, I did a commentary going over how I see voting being compliant with the Torah's instructions to choose leaders, and that it's our obligation even if the system may be dishonest. Today, I'd like to look at another aspect about voting. As with previous elections, there was debate this year over whether voting for the lesser of two evils is acceptable. To set the stage, let's look at a hypothetical example that's based in reality. I'm going to use abortion in the example. It's a controversial topic every election. As we went over in a previous commentary, and as Pastor Daniel looked at in his Death of America series, abortion is strictly forbidden by God. There are other policies to also consider, like LGBT issues and more, but we'll just use this one to keep our example simple. Let's say we have three candidates running for president. The United States of America is composed of 50 states. Candidate A wants to force every state to allow abortions. Candidate B wants to let each state choose whether to allow abortions in that state. And candidate C wants to outlaw abortions across the entire country, not allowing any state to perform them. Candidate C's stance lines up the closest with God's commandments. If we want God's will to be done in this country as it is in heaven, Christians would vote for candidate C. But what if candidate C doesn't exist, and we only have candidates A and B? There are two options I've seen Christians take. They'll either vote for candidate B or they won't vote at all. Those who vote for candidate B do so because even though abortions wouldn't be banned everywhere, this candidate would allow individual states to ban abortion. With candidate A, every state would have to allow abortion. So with candidate B, there would be less places in the U.S. that would perform abortions. Those who refrain from voting do so because they don't want abortion anywhere. It's all or nothing. They feel that since allowing any abortions is wicked, they would be compromising if they vote for a candidate who doesn't ban them across the entire country. They see their vote for candidate B as support for a compromising candidate. So is voting for the lesser of two evils sin? Would God prefer we completely refrain from getting involved rather than support a flawed candidate? Are there scriptural examples of godly people supporting bad leaders? Let's go to this week's portion after Pharaoh had his dreams. Genesis 41:8. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, for some background, Pharaoh was the ruler of Egypt. One of my first commentaries for Corner Fringe was about all the false gods of Egypt. Now, despite its flaws, the United States has had a strong Christian presence throughout its existence. Presidential candidates will at least give Christianity lip service. Back in Joseph's time, Egypt was a purely pagan nation. So now, after nobody could interpret Pharaoh's dreams, the chief butler told him about Joseph, who was able to interpret dreams in prison. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So the Pharaoh, the ruler of this pagan nation that worshiped a multitude of false gods, had Joseph brought to him for assistance. How would Joseph respond? As a follower of Yahweh, would he decline supporting the Pharaoh? Now, back in Genesis 39, it said that Yahweh was with Joseph and made him successful. Therefore, would Joseph refuse to compromise his morals and accept punishment rather than help Pharaoh? So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Not only did Joseph agree to help the pagan Pharaoh, he said God would be the one to give Pharaoh an answer. Is this blasphemy, saying that God would support the ruler of a nation that served multiple false gods? Well, in the next few verses, Pharaoh told his dreams to Joseph. Then in verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now Joseph said it was God who gave these dreams to Pharaoh. Joseph gave the interpretation, and as we know from the rest of Genesis, the interpretation was correct. So would Joseph stop here? Would he say that he interpreted the dream God gave and now he's done? Surely he wouldn't want to support this pagan ruler anymore, right? Verse 33, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Joseph actually gave further advice to Pharaoh and instructed him how to be successful. He was supporting the pagan ruler. And how did Pharaoh respond? So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh offered to make Joseph the second highest ranked person in the country. Did Joseph accept? Surely he must have declined. Hey, sorry, Pharaoh, I wouldn't even vote for you, much less work for you. Verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Joseph accepted the offer and was a dutiful servant of the Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't a follower of Yahweh, but Joseph accepted the opportunity to have as much influence as possible. And as we'll see in next week's commentary, God used Joseph to save his family and all of Egypt. Let's look at another example of followers of Yahweh supporting pagan leadership. Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So here we have the king of Babylon who worshiped a false god conquering Judah. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So the king of Babylon sought servants from among the conquered Israelites. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Adeb-Nego. Now, over the next several verses, these four abstained from the appointed delicacies because they did not want to defile themselves. They showed they wouldn't compromise on God's law. So they probably wouldn't serve this pagan king, right? Verse 18. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. They agreed to serve the king. And they didn't just do it half-heartedly because he was a pagan. They far exceeded all these other servants of the king. Now, Daniel chapter 2 is a lot like what happened with Joseph. Daniel interpreted the king's dream that nobody else could, and these four were promoted to the highest positions in Babylon. Now, in Daniel 3, the king famously threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Adeb-Nego into a furnace because they wouldn't compromise and bow down to an image. The king ordered the murder of believers of Yahweh. That's even worse than the candidates from the earlier example. But God miraculously saved them. Daniel 3:28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And then also, Daniel was famously thrown to the lions in chapter 6 because he wouldn't stop praying to God. They showed they were willing to sacrifice their own lives rather than compromise before God. Yet they didn't consider it compromising to support ungodly rulers, even rulers who tried murdering them. If godly men like Joseph, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah could offer this much service to pagan rulers who are worse than the candidates we have to vote for, and God used that influence to help the nations, I believe we can vote for the lesser of two evils in hopes that God will use them. Going back to our example, the people who support abortion have no issue voting for their candidate. If we don't support the lesser of two evils, the greater of two evils will win. And it'll take time, but if we continue to support the lesser of two evils and the lesser evils keep winning, those evils will continue to get less evil and eventually they'll become good. Shabbat Shalom.